The station called Athenium 9 hung in the cold silence of dead space, spinning slowly around a star that had stopped burning 1,000,000 years ago. It was enormous, a ring of metal and glass, wide enough to hold cities inside it, built by the 12 most powerful alien species in the known galaxy. They called themselves the Concord of 12, and they had ruled the stars for longer than most civilizations had existed. Deep inside the station, past hundreds of locked doors and guarded hallways, there was a vault that very few beings were allowed to enter. Inside that vault, sitting on a platform made of white stone, was an object. It had no name that anyone remembered, so they simply called it Relic 0. It was about the size of a human coffin, smooth and dark, and its surface looked like liquid glass that had been frozen mid-ripple. No scanner could identify what it was made of. No tool could scratch it. No energy beam could heat it. No force in the known universe could make it do anything at all. For 4,300 years, the greatest minds from all 12 species had tried everything they could think of to make the relic respond. The Alvari, beings made of pure light and energy, had poured their ancient resonance waves into it for decades. The Kethri, towering insect-like creatures with brilliant scientific minds, had bombarded it with every frequency they knew. The Dravoshi, cold-blooded reptilian strategists, had tried to crack it open with focused gravity beams. Nothing worked. The relic sat there, dark and silent, as if it were mocking them all. It was classified in every official record as inert absolute, a dead object with no function, no purpose, and no response. But they kept it anyway, because something that old and that mysterious was too important to throw away. Shipmaster Valith Dranok was the one responsible for the relic wing of the station. He was Kethri, 8 feet tall, covered in a dark exoskeleton that clicked softly when he walked, with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see in spectrums most species could not even imagine. Valith had spent the last 40 years of his life overseeing the vault, and in all that time the relic had not moved, not flickered, not done a single interesting thing. He had come to think of it as the most expensive piece of nothing in the galaxy. Still, every morning he checked the sensors, reviewed the logs, and filed his reports. It was his duty, and the Kethri took duty very seriously. On the day everything changed, a human arrived at the station. Her name was Amara Osei, and she was 28 years old. She was not tall or strong or particularly loud. She had dark skin and dark eyes, and she kept her hair in short twists close to her head. She carried a bag over one shoulder that held her clothes, her data pad, and a worn leather sketchbook that her grandmother had given her before she left Earth. Amara was a xenoarchaeologist, someone who studied the ancient objects and ruins left behind by alien civilizations. She had graduated at the top of her class and had begged for a posting on Athenium 9, the most important research station in the galaxy. But when she arrived, she quickly learned that being human here meant being invisible. Humanity had only been traveling among the stars for 200 years. Compared to species that had been spacefaring for tens of thousands of years, humans were babies, clumsy, short-lived, and unremarkable. The Concord had admitted humans as junior observers only a decade ago, and most of the alien delegates on the station treated the small human team with polite disinterest at best and open contempt at worst. Amara was assigned to a subvault 3 levels below the main research floors. Her job was to catalog minor artifacts, broken pieces of old pottery, fragments of alien tools, things that no one important wanted to study. It was boring work, and she did it alone. Her supervisor was a Kethri researcher who sent her instructions through text messages and never once visited her in person. She did not complain. She told herself that being here at all was enough, that just breathing the same recycled air as the greatest discoveries in the galaxy was a privilege. But at night, when her shift was over and the corridors were empty, she felt the loneliness settle on her like dust. It was during one of these late nights, 3 weeks after her arrival, that Amara found herself wandering. She had finished her cataloging early and could not sleep, so she walked through the quiet halls of the station with no particular destination in mind. Her feet carried her upward, through service corridors and empty stairwells, until she reached a long observation gallery she had never visited before. The gallery had a glass floor, and below it she could see a large vault chamber bathed in pale blue light. And there, sitting on its white stone platform far below her, was Relic 0. Amara had read about it, of course. Everyone who studied xenoarchaeology knew about the mysterious dead relic that had defeated the best minds in the galaxy. But reading about it and seeing it were very different things. It was beautiful. Even from above, even through the thick glass, she could feel something about it. Not a sound, not a vibration, but a kind of quiet heaviness, like the air before a storm. She sat down on the glass floor, cross-legged, and pulled her sketchbook from her bag. She did not think about scanning it or analyzing it. She did not pull out any instruments. She simply looked at it, the way an artist looks at something they want to understand, and she began to draw. Moved slowly across the page, tracing the relic's curves, its strange surface, the way the blue light played across its dark skin. She drew for nearly an hour, lost in the simple pleasure of observation. She did not notice the moment it happened. Far below her, on the surface of the relic, something moved. It was small, just a ripple, like a single drop of rain falling into still water. The ripple spread slowly across the relic's surface, and then it did something that no sensor had ever recorded in 4,300 years of observation. It moved toward her. The ripple traveled across the surface of the relic, in the direction of the gallery where Amara sat, as if the object was reaching out, as if it had sensed something above it and wanted to get closer. It lasted less than 5 seconds, and then the surface went still again. Amara did not see it. She was focused on her drawing, shading the edges of the relic's form with the graphite pencil in her hand. Careful strokes, humming a tune her grandmother used to sing. She finished her sketch, looked at it with a small, satisfied nod, closed her book, and went to bed. She slept well that night, better than she had since arriving on the station. The next morning, Shipmaster Valith sat at his monitoring station and reviewed the overnight sensor logs from the relic vault, as he did every morning. He scrolled through the data with the bored efficiency of someone who expected to find nothing. Then he stopped. His 4 hands went very still. His compound eyes locked on to a single line of data on his screen. It read, "Surface deviation detected. Duration 4.7 seconds. Trigger unknown." Valith read it again. Then he read it a 3rd time. In 40 years of watching the relic, he had never seen those words appear on his screen. In 4,300 years of recorded observation, no one had. In his chair, and for the first time in a very long career, Shipmaster Valith Dranok felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel. He felt afraid. Valith did not tell anyone at first. He ran the sensor data through every diagnostic program he had, checking for errors, for glitches, for some mechanical explanation that would let him go back to his comfortable routine. But the data was clean. Something had moved on the surface of Relic 0, and it had moved in a direction, toward the observation gallery above the vault. He pulled up the security footage from the gallery and saw a small human woman sitting on the glass floor with a book in her lap, drawing with a wooden pencil. He stared at the image for a long time. Then he contacted Grand Scholar Teonis. Teonis was Alvari, one of the oldest beings on the station, a creature made of shifting light, who floated rather than walked, and who spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through crystal. The Alvari were the eldest of the 12 species, and they carried that age like a crown. Theonis had spent over 300 years personally studying Relic Zero, and he considered himself the foremost authority on precursor artifacts in the galaxy. When Valith showed him the data, Theonis flickered, a sign of irritation among his kind. "A surface ripple means nothing," he said, his voice calm and dismissive. "We induced far greater reactions with our resonance experiments decades ago. This is likely a delayed echo, nothing more." "With respect, Grand Scholar," Valith replied, his mandibles clicking carefully, "your resonance experiments never produced a directional response. This ripple moved toward a specific point in space." Theonis flickered again, brighter this time, but said nothing more. He agreed to observe the next round of monitoring, if only to prove that the Kethri was wasting his time. Meanwhile, Amara knew nothing of any of this. She went about her work in the subvault, cataloging fragments and filing reports that no one read, herself drawn back to the observation gallery. It had become her quiet place, the one spot on the station where she did not feel small. She sat down on the glass floor again, opened her sketchbook, and began a new drawing. This time she was not drawing the relic. She was drawing from memory, a landscape she had carried in her heart since childhood. Her grandmother's village in the hills of Ghana, the red earth paths, the mango trees heavy with fruit, the tin roofs glinting in the afternoon sun. As she drew, she hummed, a soft, wandering melody, with no particular shape, the kind of sound a person makes when they are alone and content. 30 meters below her, the relic woke up. Its surface shifted, not a ripple this time, but a slow, deliberate reshaping, like clay being molded by invisible hands. The dark liquid glass pushed upward, forming ridges and valleys, rising into rough shapes that grew more defined with every passing second. Hills appeared on its surface, small, rounded hills. Between them, thin raised lines that could have been paths, and clustered in one area, tiny angular forms that looked almost like buildings with flat roofs. The relic was sculpting the landscape Amara was drawing. It was not a perfect copy. The shapes were rough, abstract, like a child's attempt to echo something beautiful it had glimpsed through a window. But the resemblance was undeniable. It was mirroring her. The alarms triggered instantly. Red lights flooded the gallery, and a piercing tone echoed through the corridors. Amara jumped to her feet, her sketchbook falling from her lap, and within minutes the gallery was full of security officers, scientists, and stunned diplomats who had been pulled from their quarters by the emergency alert. Below them, the relic's surface was already settling back to stillness, but the sensors had captured everything. Every ridge, every tiny sculpted rooftop. The data spread through the station like wildfire. By morning, Amara had been pulled from her cataloging duties and placed in a sterile observation room. Commander Haruki Tanaka, the senior human diplomat on Athenium 9, was at her side within the hour. He was a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 50s, who had spent 20 years navigating the delicate politics of being human among ancient alien civilizations. He looked at Amara with an expression that was equal parts concern and calculation. "Tell me exactly what you did," he said. "I just drew a picture," Amara replied, and she could hear how absurd it sounded, even as she said it. The formal investigation began that same day. Theonis led it, with Valith assisting, and representatives from all 12 species observing through secured channels. The relic chamber was sealed, and Amara was brought before a panel of alien scientists who looked at her the way someone might look at a laboratory specimen, with curiosity, but no warmth. They asked her hundreds of questions. They scanned her body with instruments she had never seen before, devices that mapped her brainwaves, measured the electromagnetic field around her skin, counted the bacteria in her lungs. They took samples of her hair, her saliva, her blood. Through it all, Amara sat quietly and answered their questions as best she could, but she could see what they were really doing. They were not trying to understand what had happened between her and the relic. They were trying to find something wrong with her, some mutation, some anomaly, some scientific explanation that would let them keep the miracle inside their own framework. If a human had triggered the relic, it could not be because of anything special about humans. It had to be a fluke, a defect, a strange accident of biology. Relic has been exposed to Aelvari resonance patterns for centuries, he told the panel, his luminous form pulsing with authority. It is far more likely that our previous work primed the object for activation, and this human simply happened to be present when the threshold was reached. Correlation is not causation. Commander Tanaka stood up from his seat at the back of the room. Then you should be able to replicate the response without her, he said, his voice even and calm. Go ahead. We will wait. Theonis did not respond to that. The controlled experiments began the following week. Amara was brought to the relic chamber under heavy observation and asked to sit near the object, while dozens of sensors recorded every particle of data. But the relic was silent. She sat there for hours, aware of the cameras, aware of the alien eyes watching her through screens, aware of the weight of their expectations and their skepticism pressing down on her like a physical force. The relic did not move. The scientists grew impatient, then frustrated, then dismissive. As I predicted, Theonis said on the third day of failed tests. The initial response was an anomaly. The object is inert once more. But Valith was not so sure. He had watched the footage carefully, and he had noticed something the others had missed. During the moments when the relic had responded, Amara had been alone, relaxed, and unobserved. During the controlled tests, she was surrounded, anxious, and performing for an audience. He kept this observation to himself for now. That night, after another long day of being prodded and scanned, and talked about as if she were not in the room, Amara could not sleep. She slipped out of her quarters and walked through the empty corridors until she reached the relic chamber. The guards knew her by now, and after checking her credentials, let her pass. She sat down on the floor, next to the relic's platform, close enough to touch the dark surface if she stretched out her hand. She was tired and frustrated and lonely in a way that went deeper than distance from home. She looked at the relic, this ancient, silent, impossible thing, and she spoke to it the way a person speaks to a stray cat they have found in an alley. They do not understand you either, huh? She said softly. Everyone wants something from you. Answers, data, proof, but nobody just sits with you, do they? She was quiet for a moment. I know what that feels like, she whispered. The relic moved. Its surface did not ripple this time. It unfolded like the petals of a flower opening at dawn. The dark shell split into curved segments that peeled slowly outward, revealing an interior that Amara had never imagined. Inside the relic was light, not the harsh light of a laboratory, but a warm, golden glow that pulsed gently, like a flower heartbeat. Within that glow, geometric shapes rotated slowly, triangles and spirals and forms she had no name for, turning through each other in a dance that seemed to mean something profound, even if she could not say what. The relic held this shape for 30 seconds, while Amara sat frozen, barely breathing, her eyes wide and wet. Then, slowly, the petals closed again, and the surface returned to its dark stillness. Amara stared at it. Her heart was hammering in her chest. You are alive, are you not? She whispered. The relic's surface shimmered, and for just one instant she saw her own face reflected in it. But the reflection was wrong. Amara was not smiling. The face in the relic was. The news of the relic's second response could not be contained. Within hours, every delegate on Athenium 9 knew that the object had opened, actually opened, for the human woman, and that it had done so only when she was alone and unmonitored by the formal test protocols. The political earthquake that followed shook the Concord to its roots. For 4,300 years, the 12 elder species had treated the relic as their shared mystery, their communal puzzle, a symbol of the ancient past that belonged to all of them equally. Now a human, a member of the youngest and least respected species in the Concord, had done what none of them could. The implications were not just scientific, they were political, and in the corridors of power on Athenium 9, politics could be far more dangerous than any weapon. Ambassador Sethek Cole of the Dravoshi was the first to make his move. Sethek was a tall, lean reptilian with silver-green scales and eyes like polished amber. He moved through diplomatic circles the way a predator moves through water, slowly, patiently, and with absolute certainty about where his next meal would come from. Within a day of the relic's opening, he had called an emergency session of the Concord Council, demanding that the relic be reclassified as a security concern and that all human access be suspended immediately. We cannot allow an unvetted species to interact with an artifact of this magnitude, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. The humans have been part of the Concord for a single decade. We know almost nothing about their capabilities or their intentions. Commander Tanaka fought back with calm precision, citing treaty clauses and observation rights, but Amara could see the strain on his face. The humans were outnumbered, outranked, and outmaneuvered at every turn. While the politicians argued, Theonis threw himself into research with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He organized a new round of experiments, not with Amara this time, but with volunteers from every other species on the station. If the relic responded to a certain behavior rather than a certain biology, then surely an Aelvery, or a Kethri, or a Dravoshi could replicate what the human had done. Alien volunteers were brought to the relic chamber one by one. They sat beside the object. They drew pictures, awkwardly, since most of these species did not have artistic traditions that used hand-drawn images. They hummed and sang. They spoke softly to the relic, mimicking the words Amara had used. The relic ignored every single one of them. It sat there, dark and cold and utterly indifferent, as if they did not exist. Theonis could not accept this. He brought in Aelvery artists, Kethri musicians, Dravoshi poets. He had them perform for hours at a time, while sensors recorded everything, nothing. The relic responded to Amara, and only to Amara. When she was brought back to the chamber, reluctantly, under heavy guard and over Sethek Cole's formal objections, the relic stirred within minutes. This time, Amara understood something she had only sensed before. The relic was not responding to what she did. It was responding to how she felt. When she was anxious or self-conscious, performing for the cameras and the panels of alien judges, the relic went quiet. But when she forgot about them, when she sank into the simple, honest act of creation, of wondering, of being present with something beautiful and unknown, the relic came alive. She tested this carefully over the following days, and the pattern held every time. If she tried to make the relic respond, it would not. If she simply sat with it and let herself be curious, open, and unguarded, it mirrored her. And the mirroring grew more complex each time. It began reflecting not just her drawings, but her emotions. When she felt calm, its surface became smooth as still water. When she felt sad, it darkened and seemed to pull inward. When she laughed once, at a memory of her grandmother scolding a goat that had eaten her laundry. The relic shimmered with a warmth that every sensor in the room registered as actual physical heat. Then came the day when the relic started giving something back. Amara was sitting cross-legged on the chamber floor, sketchbook open, drawing idle patterns while she let her mind wander. The relic's surface shifted, and instead of mirroring her, it showed her something new. An image formed on its surface, not a reflection of her thoughts, but a projection from within. She saw stars, but not the stars she knew. These were different, older, burning in colors she had never seen, arranged in patterns that matched no constellation in any. She saw structures, vast, impossible architecture that stretched across the space between those alien stars, built from materials that seemed to bend light itself. And she saw a figure. It stood alone on the edge of something enormous, a platform, a cliff, a threshold, looking out into a darkness that went on forever. The figure was not human, not Aelvari, not any species she recognized. It was something older, something from so far back in time that the word ancient felt childish and small. And it was alone. Amara could feel the loneliness radiating from the image, like heat from a fire. It was not a mild loneliness, not the kind that comes from being away from home for a few weeks. It was the loneliness of being the last, the absolute, final, total last of your kind. She understood then, with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to her heart, that she was seeing the memories of whoever had built the Relic. This was the architect. And the architect had been alone for a very, very long time. Amara sat with the vision until it faded, and when it was gone, she found that she was crying, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer weight of what she had felt. She wiped her eyes, took a breath, and made a decision. The next morning, she requested a formal audience with the Concord Council. Sefik Cole tried to block her, but Tanaka invoked a procedural clause that guaranteed any researcher the right to present findings. And the council, curious despite themselves, allowed it. Amara stood before 12 species, alone, a 28-year-old human in a room full of beings who had watched stars be born. "I believe the relic is a test," she said, keeping her voice steady, even as her hands trembled at her sides. "But not the kind of test you have been assuming. You have been treating it as a lock that needs a key, a puzzle that needs a solution, a machine that needs the right input. But it is not any of those things." She paused and looked around the room at faces and forms that ranged from crystalline to scaled to luminous. The relic responds to emotion, specifically to curiosity, creativity, vulnerability, and openness. It does not care how old your species is, how advanced your technology is, or how much power you control. It is looking for a mind that approaches the unknown, not with the desire to conquer or comprehend, but with the willingness to simply connect. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Theonis broke it first, his light flaring with barely contained anger. "You are suggesting," he said, "that the Aelvari, the oldest civilization in the galaxy, failed to activate this artifact because we lacked sufficient feeling?" "I am suggesting," Amara replied, "that you approached it as a puzzle to be solved, and it was never a puzzle. It was a conversation, waiting to be heard. Happen." P. Sefik Cole rose from his seat, his amber eyes cold. "This is human propaganda," he said, "designed to inflate the importance of an insignificant species. I move to have this researcher detained and the relic sealed." P. The room erupted into argument. Amara was escorted out, while the diplomats shouted at each other in a dozen languages. That evening, shaken and exhausted, she returned to the chamber one final time. The guards let her in, though they looked uncomfortable doing so. P. She sat beside the relic, and this time she did not draw or hum. She simply talked. "They are going to take me away from you," she said quietly. "They are scared of what you mean, and scared people do not listen very well." She was quiet for a moment, then smiled a little. "My grandmother used to tell me a story," she said, "about a spider named Anansi, who lived at the very beginning of the world, when the sky was dark and empty. Anansi was small, and not very strong, but he was clever and curious, and one night he climbed to the top of the tallest tree and began to weave. He wove, and the threads he spun caught the light of the first sunrise, and they became the stars. And that is why, my grandmother said, if you look at the night sky, you can see that the stars are connected by invisible threads, like a web made by a very small and very brave spider. The Relic sang. The sound was unlike anything that had ever been recorded on the station. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the floor and the walls and the bones of everyone who heard it. Every sensor on Athenium-9 overloaded. The Relic's surface blazed with light, and from that light burst a projection so vast that it filled the entire chamber and spilled outward through the corridors. It was a map of the galaxy, but marked with hundreds of points of light, scattered across the stars, in regions both known and unknown. Some of the points were in well-charted space, but many of them were in regions that the Concord had declared off-limits centuries ago, sectors labeled as naturally hazardous, empty, or forbidden. The projection held for 11 seconds, burning every detail into the station's memory banks, and then it vanished. The Relic went dark. Amara sat in the silence, her heart pounding, her hands pressed flat against the cold floor. In his office 3 levels above, Theonis stared at the data that was now permanently etched into the station's records. His luminous form dimmed to almost nothing, the Elvari equivalent of going pale. "Those coordinates," he whispered to Valith, who stood beside him. "Some of them are in regions we were told were empty, regions we were forbidden to enter." Valith said nothing, but his 4 hands curled slowly into fists. Activated. It had opened a door that the most powerful species in the galaxy had spent centuries trying to keep shut. The map changed everything, but not in the way Amara had hoped. Instead of wonder, it brought fear. Instead of unity, it brought suspicion. And instead of answers, it brought a question that the most powerful species in the galaxy did not want anyone to ask. Why had they declared those regions forbidden in the first place? Valith was the first to break. He came to Amara's quarters in the middle of the night, moving quietly through the corridors with a stealth that was surprising for someone of his size. Commander Tanaka was already there. Valith had sent him an encrypted message an hour earlier, and the human diplomat had come without hesitation. The 3 of them sat in Amara's small room, and Valith told them what he knew. "The K3 archives go back further than most species realize," he said, his compound eyes flickering in the low light. "We are meticulous record keepers. It is in our nature, and buried deep in our oldest files. There are references to beings called the Shapers, the ones who built the Relic," Amara said. Valith nodded, his mandibles clicking softly. "The records are fragmentary, incomplete, and clearly censored. Someone went through them long ago and removed the most important details. But what remains paints a picture that I find deeply troubling." He told them that the Shapers were not just an ancient species. They were the ancient species, a civilization that had existed before the current universe's stars had fully formed, in an era so distant that even the Elvari had no memory of it. And the Concord's elder species had not simply failed to activate the Relic. They had known, at least partially, what it was, and they had been afraid. "The forbidden regions," Tanaka said, his voice low and controlled. "They are not naturally hazardous, are they?" "I do not believe so," Valith replied. "I believe they were sealed because they contain more relics. Relics that the Concord's founders did not want anyone to find." The implications sat in the room like a weight. For millennia, the elder species had told the galaxy that the forbidden zones were dangerous, uninhabitable, naturally lethal to all forms of life. They had enforced these boundaries with military patrols and legal penalties. And all along, they may have been hiding the greatest discovery in the history of civilization. Amara felt something cold settle in her chest. Why, she asked, why would they hide them? Valith looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his alien eyes that she recognized as sadness. Because the relics choose, he said, and the Concord's founders could not accept the possibility that they might not be chosen. The political situation deteriorated rapidly after that. Ambassador Sethik Kal, whether he knew about the cover-up or not, pushed his coalition to act. Within 2 days, he had assembled a voting bloc of 6 elder species, enough to pass an emergency resolution. The resolution was simple and devastating. Relic 0 would be reclassified as a strategic asset. All data from the map projection would be classified at the highest level, and the entire human delegation would be expelled from Athenium-9 on grounds of insufficient security clearance. Commander Tanaka fought it with every diplomatic tool he had, but the numbers were against him. The vote was scheduled for the following morning, and everyone on the station knew the outcome was already decided. That night, Amara was placed under armed guard in her quarters. 2 Dravoshi soldiers stood outside her door, polite but immovable. She sat on her bed and stared at the wall, and she felt something she had not felt since arriving on the station. She felt angry, not the quiet, patient frustration she had carried for weeks. Something hotter and sharper, a fury born from the knowledge that the relic had reached out across thousands of years, had waited through the silence of millennia for someone to listen, and now the very beings it had waited for were going to lock it away again because they could not stand the truth of its choosing. 3 levels below her, the relic felt it too. No one understood how. No one had ever established a mechanism for the connection between the relic and Amara. But the sensors in the vault chamber began screaming. The relic's surface cracked. Not the gentle unfolding of before. This was violent, jagged, as if something inside it was trying to tear its way out. Light bled through the cracks. Not the warm golden glow Amara had seen, but a harsh, white, desperate light that pulsed in irregular bursts. The station shuddered. Gravitational anomalies rippled outward from the vault, small but unmistakable, causing objects to float and fall in. The corridors nearby, causing the lights to flicker, causing the ancient structure of Athenaeum-9 itself to groan. Alarms echoed through every level. Valith ran to the vault and stared up at readings in horror. The relic was destabilizing, and the energy output was climbing with every minute. But it was not attacking. Valith could see that clearly in the data. There was no aggression in the energy patterns, no weapon signature, no directed force. The relic was grieving. It had found someone after 4,300 years of silence, and that someone was being taken away, and the ancient object was responding the only way it could, with anguish. If we do not bring her to the chamber, Valith told Theonis, who had arrived pale and flickering, I believe the destabilization will continue to escalate. The relic is not a weapon, but the gravitational disruption alone could tear this station apart. Theonis stared at the data, and for a moment, his ancient pride warred with the reality in front of him. Then he gave the order. While the relic shook the station to its bones, Commander Tanaka made the most desperate move of his career. He stood before the emergency session of the Concord Council, called early because of the crisis, and invoked Article 7 of the Concord Charter, a clause so old and so obscure that most delegates had never heard of it. Article 7 granted any member species the right to advocate on behalf of a non-represented sentient entity, a being or intelligence that was not a member of the Concord, but demonstrated clear signs of consciousness. Relic 0 is not an artifact, Tanaka declared, his voice cutting through the chaos. It responds to emotion, it mirrors consciousness, it acts with purpose and feeling, it is a sentient entity, and under Article 7, it has the right to a representative, and it has already chosen one. Erupted. Sethik Kal shouted that it was a trick, a legal fantasy, a human manipulation. But the charter was clear, and the legal scholars of 3 different species confirmed that Tanaka's invocation was valid. The vote on expulsion was suspended pending review, a process that could take weeks. Tanaka had bought them time, but only just. Amara was escorted to the relic chamber under guard, and the moment she stepped through the door, the cracking stopped. The light faded. The gravitational anomalies settled. The relic's surface smoothed, and the station went quiet. She walked to the platform and placed her hand on the relic's surface. It was warm, not hot, not cold, warm, like the skin of a living thing. "What do you need from me?" she asked. The answer came not in words, but in feeling. The relic pulled her inward, gently like a hand offered in the dark. Disappeared. She was standing in a place that was not a place. A vast, empty expanse, where the stars were dying. Not fading, dying. Going out one by one like candles being snuffed in a long, dark hallway. And beside her stood the architect. It was tall, impossibly tall, but it did not feel threatening. Its form was difficult to look at directly, as if it existed in more dimensions than her eyes could process. But the feeling that radiated from it was unmistakable. Loneliness. A loneliness so deep and so old that it had become a kind of landscape. A geography of loss that stretched out in every direction. The architect was the last of its kind. Its species had lived and loved and built wonders that spanned galaxies, and now they were all gone, and the universe they had called home was dying around them. Amara watched as the architect worked. Even at the end of everything, it was building. She saw it pour its knowledge, its memories, its love, its hope into objects. Dozens of them, hundreds, small, dark, beautiful things that it scattered across the dying universe like seeds thrown into wind. Each one was a letter. Each one was a message that said, "We were here, we lived, we mattered, and if you are reading this, then something survived, and that is enough." The relics were not tools or weapons or libraries. They were love letters from the end of the world, written by someone who refused to let the darkness have the last word. And they were sealed, not with codes or locks or passwords, but with a condition. They could only be opened by a mind that mirrored the architect's own nature, a mind that faced the vast, terrifying unknown, and responded not with the desire to conquer or control, but with the simple, brave, foolish willingness to connect. Amara understood now why the elder species had failed. The Aelvari had approached the relic as a puzzle, something to be decoded and mastered. The Dravoshi had seen it as a resource, something to be claimed and used. The Kethri had treated it as a data set, something to be measured and categorized. Every species had tried to take something from the relic. Amara was the first to simply sit with it. She was the first to look at something ancient and unknown, and respond not with, "What can I get from you?" but with, "You must be so lonely." The vision faded, and Amara opened her eyes. She was back in the chamber, her hand still on the relic's worn surface, and her face was wet with tears. Valith, Tanaka, and a dozen delegates who had followed the crisis to the chamber stood around her in silence. Amara turned to face them. Her voice was rough but steady. "It is not a weapon," she said. "It is not a library. It is not a tool or a test or a prize to be won." She took a breath. "It is a letter from someone who died, alone at the end of a universe, who poured everything they had into the hope that someday someone would find it and know that they existed." She looked around the room at the ancient, powerful, frightened faces staring back at her. It waited 4,000 years for someone to just listen. The chamber was silent. Then the relic bloomed open, fully, completely, wider than it ever had, and from its core rose a projection. It was the architect, tall, luminous, heartbreaking in its solitude, looking directly at Amara, and through her, at every being in the room. It spoke a single word, The word was in a language older than the stars, a language that no species in the room had ever heard before. But every single one of them understood it perfectly. The word was finally. The projection of the architect lasted only 90 seconds. But in that time, it did something that no weapon, no treaty, no political speech in the history of the Concord had ever accomplished. It made every being in the room feel the same thing at the same time. The architect's final message was not data. It was not a blueprint, or a warning, or a set of instructions. It was a feeling, transmitted directly into the consciousness of every creature present. And the feeling was this, what it was like to be the last one alive. It was the memory of waking up in a universe that was going dark, and knowing that every voice that had ever spoken your language was silent. It was the memory of looking at your hands, and understanding that when they stopped moving, there would be no one left to remember what hands were for. It was the weight of love with nowhere to go. A heart still beating in a body that the universe had already forgotten. Through all of that grief, running through it like a river of light through a dark canyon, was hope. Because the architect had not surrendered. At the end of everything, at the absolute bottom of the deepest loneliness any being had ever known, it had chosen to build, to create, to reach forward across the impossible distance of time and say, "Someone will find this, someone will hear me. I do not know who or when or how, but I believe they will come." The projection faded, and the architect was gone. The chamber was silent, except for a sound that no one had expected. Grand Scholar Teonis was weeping. The Alvari did not cry, not in any way that the other species had ever witnessed. They were beings of pure energy, ancient beyond measure, and they had long ago transcended what they considered the primitive mechanics of emotional expression. But Teonis was making a sound like wind through broken glass, and his luminous form was flickering in patterns that the other Aelvari in the room recognized with shock as the oldest form of their grief language, a dialect so ancient that most of them had forgotten it existed. He was not alone. Valith stood motionless, his forearms hanging at his sides, his compound eyes reflecting the fading light, and the clicking of his mandibles had gone completely silent, the Kethri equivalent of being struck speechless. Ambassador Sethic Cole sat in his chair with his amber eyes wide open and his clawed hands resting flat on his knees, and for the first time since anyone on the station could remember, the Dravoshi politician had absolutely nothing to say. The architect's message had bypassed language, culture, biology, and politics. It had spoken to the one thing that every sentient being in the galaxy shared, regardless of species: the fear of being forgotten, and the desperate, beautiful hope that something of who they were would survive. In the days that followed, the political crisis did not disappear. Ancient structures do not collapse overnight, and the fears and ambitions that had driven Sethic Cole's coalition did not evaporate simply because their hearts had been moved. But the ground had shifted beneath the argument, and everyone could feel it. The emergency vote on expelling the humans was quietly withdrawn. The motion to classify the map data was tabled indefinitely. Instead, a new committee was formed, not to seize the relic or weaponize its contents, but to study the architect's message and determine what the coordinates meant. Valith presented his findings about the Forbidden Zones to the full council, and for the first time, the elder species were forced to confront a truth they had buried for millennia. The forbidden regions of space were not hazardous. They had been sealed because the Concord's founders, the very first generation of the 12 elder species, had discovered them, relics long ago, and had tried to activate them. They had failed, and rather than admit that failure, rather than accept the possibility that they were not worthy of whatever the relics contained, they had hidden them away and told the galaxy they did not exist. The shame of this revelation was immense, but it was Theonis who addressed it most honestly. He stood before the council, diminished, quieter than anyone had ever seen him, and spoke without any of his usual arrogance. "We told ourselves that we sealed those regions for safety," he said, "but the truth is simpler and uglier. We could not bear the idea that the most important discovery in the history of our galaxy might not be meant for us." He turned to Amara, who sat in the human delegation's modest seats at the edge of the chamber. "We were wrong," he said, "not because your species is better than ours, but because you still carry something we lost a long time ago. The willingness to approach the unknown without armor. It was the closest thing to an apology the Aelvari had ever offered to anyone, and the room understood its weight. Over the following weeks, Amara worked with Valith, Tanaka, and a growing coalition of scientists and diplomats from multiple species to establish what she called the first listening protocol. The idea was simple but radical. The other relics, hundreds of them, scattered across the galaxy, would not be approached by military fleets or research teams armed with scanning equipment. Instead, small groups would be sent to each site, diverse groups drawn from many species, trained not in analysis or extraction, but in the skills that had opened Relic Zero: patience, curiosity, creative expression, emotional honesty, the willingness to sit with something unknown and simply be present with it. It was, as one Dravashi scientist put it with grudging respect, the most absurd and most logical approach to first contact anyone has ever proposed. Amara trained the first group herself. She taught them to draw, not well, but honestly. She taught them to tell stories and to listen to silence. She taught them that the relics were not locked doors, but lonely beings, and that the key to reaching them was not force or cleverness, but the simple courage of vulnerability. Humanity's position in the Concord transformed. The change was not instant, and it was not without resistance. Thousands of years of prejudice do not vanish in a season, but the shift was real and irreversible. Humans were no longer the youngest, weakest, most primitive species in the room. They were something else now. Something the elder species did not have a word for. A people who could look into the face of the vast, incomprehensible, terrifying unknown, and say, not how do I conquer this, or how do I profit from this, but hello, tell me about. It was such a simple thing, and it had taken the galaxy 4,000 years to find a species willing to do it. On the last night before the first exploration teams departed for the relic sites, Amara sat alone in the observation gallery one final time. The relic below her had gone quiet since the architect's message. Its surface was still and dark, its purpose fulfilled, its letter finally delivered after an unimaginable wait. Amara sat on the glass floor, with her sketchbook open, looking down at the object that had changed her life and the future of her species. "Thank you for waiting for us," she whispered. The relic's surface warmed. She could feel it even through the glass, a gentle heat that rose like sunlight through a window. Then slowly, the relic projected one final image. It was not a map. It was not a memory. It was a door. A shimmering threshold of light, hanging in the air above the relic's surface like a window, cut into the fabric of reality itself. Through it, Amara could see something. A place, a space, a somewhere that her mind could not fully process, but her heart recognized instantly. It was where the architect had gone. Not dead, not exactly, but somewhere beyond, somewhere past the edge of the universe that had died, waiting in a place where endings and beginnings were the same thing. The door hung there, patient, glowing, and Amara understood what it meant. The relics were not the end of the story. They were the introduction. The architect had left a trail of letters across the galaxy, and at the end of that trail was an invitation, a chance to meet the being who had written them, to learn what it knew, to carry its story forward into whatever came next. Amara smiled. She picked up her pencil and began to draw the door, carefully, precisely, with the quiet focus that the Relic had loved from the very first. Night. She drew until her hand was tired, and then she closed her sketchbook and sat for a while in the silence, feeling the warmth of the Relic beneath her and the weight of the stars above. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid of the unknown. That, in the end, was what the Relic had recognized in her. Not intelligence, not power, not the accumulated wisdom of millennia, but the simple, stubborn, wonderfully human refusal to let mystery be anything other than an invitation. Amara stood, tucked her sketchbook under her arm, and walked out of the gallery toward whatever came next. Behind her, the Relic glowed softly in the dark, and across the galaxy, on 100 dead worlds, in vaults sealed since before the stars were born, in the silent depths of regions that the Concord had called forbidden for longer than most species could remember, the other relics began to ripple